And good morning. And this is going to be an entire discussion about why vaccines are dangerous. And I think that we are being overly vaccinated, and I believe that COVID actually began in a lab somewhere in China, or it is just a systematic way of the government to inject a tracking device into you. Yeah, let's see what the comments say about that. No, get vaccinated. There is no reason to not get vaccinated. You know, we watch some sort of Samsung TV thingamabob when you turn the TV on, and it's just a web stream. And our TV is set to the Bob Ross channel. I love Bob. He and I share the same hair. And they'll break for commercials. And one of the commercials they've been running is, you have questions about the vaccine. We have answers. I'm like, look, haven't you been living in America in the modern age of healthcare your entire friggin' life? You've had vaccines. You've had lots of vaccines. You've had vaccinations to go into grade school. And this is no different. And then people saying, oh, but I will never take the flu shot. Well, all right, fine. This is different. Do it not for you, but do it for the rest of your community. And if you don't, well, I ain't gonna say what I think you are. But, all right. Hey, so let's talk a little bit about epidemiology and spread of disease. It's actually a very topical topic of topics. All right. So, you know, we've been talking about some of the origins of microbiology correspond with the origins of dreadful outbreaks of horrible disease. So, the plague, for instance, and epidemic typhus and cholera. All of these things are typically linked to poor sanitation and poor hygiene. We did not know, we being humanity, disease spread. You know, the idea of the miasma, of the humors. We've been watching Outlander, and Claire, the surgeon from 1970, is working in, 1768 or something now. The last episode we saw, she was making a lot of bread and trying to generate penicillin. And in part, hey, you're violating the thread of history. On the other hand, I think making penicillin is more difficult than just getting moldy bread. Regardless. The notion that bacteria cause disease was not something that was completely understood. It was not recognized. And so basic sanitation wasn't fully understood. And it takes the thinking and putting things together, idea of like Koch's postulates, to what we take for granted now, that it's not going to be a good idea to put the outhouse right next to the well. That just seems a little hinky. Let's don't do that. Or, yeah, that's a really nice quiet corner of the land, but it's right by the stream. Let's don't do that. How about we'll pull drinking water from this side of the ford, and we can wash dishes and do things on this side of the ford, and then the horses can come through here, but let's not drink downstream. It didn't occur to them. So this is where we begin to think about the idea of epidemiology, and that is the science of determining sources and causes of disease. We're trying to apply a scientific method, and I think we can hopefully agree that the notion of bloodletting, the notion of the different humors, the idea of the miasma doesn't hold up particularly well to scientific analysis. So we have now the mechanism by which we can begin systematically, we may not be able to identify it, but at least we have a systematic way to begin looking for the sources of disease, disability, death in populations. So the people that do it, hopefully scientists with knowledge of infectious, inherited, and environmentally induced diseases, and it may require a bit of statistics as well. The Center for Disease Control is the primary spot for coordinating this in the U.S. And what we're trying to do is understand new diseases, unexpected occurrences of known diseases, as in when measles outbreaks occur. What causes this? So public health, these are the different kinds of procedures that we are trying to do to protect the public from disease. And this is where we have a whole range of people, Dr. Anthony Fauci being one of them. Public health offices of all state and local governments. The Macon County has a public health department. And their goal is to do monitoring and prevent disease. They are doing this through vaccination, treatment, quarantine, education, sanitation. And if those of you that read the paper might have observed that there was a local grocery store not too far from here that had a rat infestation. That's not sanitary. If there were sanitized rats, sure, they could pee on things, but the rats were probably coming in and out, and they were a wild population. So if you want to have like your own grocery store mice, like with a little brand wandering around on them, that's fine. But if you're letting mice in from the wild population and then they're peeing on the produce, that's not good. So these are the systems we have in place to begin regulating these things. Now, we talked a little bit about cholera and I think the localization. This is an idea of what's called the Broad Street Pump experiment, in that a gentleman by the name of Jon Snow, no relation to the Game of Thrones character, or maybe he is, I don't know, different spelling. He was able to look at what was going on in a retrospective way, in that disease is happening, and he began to put things together to identify that there was a pump that was being used for water collection, and that there are deaths that are associated with this pump. So as we see other pumps, there's no death, but where we see the areas nearest the pump, that's where we see the deaths. So he begins to put this together, and the solution is fairly simple in this case: remove the pump handle, because this is a contaminated pump. Now, this, I need to actually update this, but I haven't yet, looking at COVID, but we can look at that as well. A form, or one of the coronaviruses that had previously rolled across the world but didn't turn into COVID was SARS, the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. And the coronavirus of 2019, 2020, 2021 is a SARS-type coronavirus. And we can begin to see the spread of this. So the spread is moving around. It's not quite as infectious as our current virus, but it could have been. And it has to do with the virus biology. So we have a lot of spread. It continues to spread with travel. And we're living in what we can do to begin reducing it. Restrict travel, try to impose quarantine, and then recognizing the transmission and trying to put blocks in the transmission. So, an example of this would be a non-infectious disease. And so epidemiologists have to be able to tease out infectious disease versus non-infectious disease. An example of this would be celiac disease. And celiac disease has some fairly significant effects for people that actually have it. You lose the ability to absorb nutrients, and you begin to irritate the lining of the small intestine. So an individual with celiac disease, if they go on a restricted diet, they have recovery. If they then observed because of a loss of wheat products because of a bread shortage, let's just say. They use rice, potatoes, they get recovery. The USA then brings in bread for children, and the symptoms return. If you remove the bread, you have recovery. If you change and not use wheat flour, you have recovery. And then finally, if you remove gluten, you have recovery, and you have begun to actually tease apart what is causing this disease. So one of the really important questions then is, when you're looking at a disease and a pathology, is it infectious or not? And that's not always easy to recognize. So here's just some examples. We have infectious diseases like viral or bacterial, and one thing we see here is the seasonal distribution of the flu. And so it absolutely exhibits a seasonality to it. And this is an example of course, an infectious disease. When we look at non-infectious diseases, and these are things primarily cancer, Alzheimer's, things like this, genetically inherited diseases, we can begin to look at different kinds of cultural aspects, looking at lung cancer and associating it with cigarette smoking. And of course, this is something that had been known for quite a while, but the tobacco industry kind of obfuscated this. We look at the distribution. Different parts of the country tend to have much higher levels of cigarette smoking, which is associated with increased amounts of lung cancer. So, an infectious disease being a food poisoning outbreak. And we can begin to see that it actually spreads. In this case, the cases are being tracked across the U.S. as food product are being distributed. And this is a fairly significant outbreak, and that food poisoning outbreaks will happen. And that's why we end up having various recalls of different food products, certainly ground beef, but recently we've had recalls of different lettuces and things like this. Sprouts are a typical great source. And what we can begin to see is the different kinds of propagations and spreads. So here is just another way of looking at it in terms of the community versus healthcare worker. And there's actually some differences going on here. The healthcare workers are probably taking somewhat greater care, and that is one way we can also begin to look at an infection versus a non-infectious disease. So a couple of definitions we've got then, and certainly this is part of our current vocabulary with COVID-19. We have the mortality rate. That's the number of deaths divided by the number of instances. How many people get it versus how many people die versus how many people have gotten it. The morbidity rate is the number of new cases over the population size, and generally it's over a very specific time period. Prevalence is the percent, the number of cases over the population size times 100. So we have a standard percentage here. And so then the CDC does present the morbidity and mortality weekly report. So we've got a way of looking at the rate of infection. We have a way of looking at, which would be the morbidity rate, a way of looking at how serious the infection is, which is, of course, the mortality rate. And then prevalence is a way of placing this into percentage. And it's one of the things that different counties now, by using statistical models, are able to give you a number, pretty good odds, of if you're in a gathering of 15 people in Macon County under this current situation, what are the chances that someone in that room has COVID-19? And now that we have the vaccine rolling out, it's not as serious an issue, but we're waiting for those numbers to go down, which is why everybody needs to get vaccinated that can. So we've got a range of different kinds of disease reservoirs and ways that diseases can manifest themselves. So just some of the things that we have looked at. As an example, smallpox, polio, measles, they are constantly in the population at low levels, and they're being spread from individual to individual. And then we've got a whole range of things that we've been covering, things like hantavirus, which was found in field mice. And plague is a bacterium that's carried on a range of different kinds of varmints, marmots, black rats, prairie dogs, squirrels. Leishmania, probably don't want to have too close contact with an armadillo or a possum. Ticks, of course, are a great way to spread a whole range of things. Mosquitoes, as we've been talking about, another brilliant vector. Snails, they are able to carry the schistosomes and provide a variety of fun and games. Rabies, by being carried by a range of different animals. Cholera, shellfish is a good way to do this. Bird flu, being carried about by ducks and geese. And COVID-19, SARS, probably from bats. Cat scratch disease by cats. Gerbils, who knows? So these are reservoirs, and then there are others, polio, smallpox, that don't really have a natural reservoir. No reservoir is required because they actually are being maintained within the population. So when we talk about reservoirs, as we've been mentioning, COVID-19 is a zoonotic type, in which the reservoir is an animal and generally not being bothered by the microbe, but able to replicate it, and then they pass it on to humans. And so this becomes a very serious issue as populations move into undeveloped areas and start pushing into different places where people had not been. The possibility of engaging with these things becomes a serious issue. We also have carriers, and it seems like there's an aspect of this for COVID as well. There are people, the term super spreader is probably used too often, but there are people that, for a variety of physiological reasons, tend to have a higher virus load when they cough, when they breathe out, and they are the ones that are spreading this primarily. Other times we can have an infected individual who's contagious but doesn't show symptoms. And this can be for a variety of reasons. Perhaps you've heard of Typhoid Mary. This was a specific case in which a woman had a case of typhoid that never really showed particular symptoms and was spreading this around. We actually have a few more things to say about that. Let's see. So another thing we can see in terms of a disease outbreak is the idea of frequency. So there is in France outbreaks occasionally of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is a prion-based disease, mad cow disease, but the human form of it. It's sporadic. There's no real pattern to it. Then we have the idea of an epidemic versus an endemic. And endemic diseases are those that are current in the population at an expected rate. And an epidemic is when the numbers get above that expected level. So we have a low level of a variety of diseases, and then occasionally it will pop up into a much higher level. That would be an epidemic. And as we know all too well, the idea of a pandemic, which is the term used for a worldwide epidemic. Seasonal means that we have regular, predictable variation. And essentially the flu, a whole range of different kinds of cold viruses and things. Just looking at this, there are a variety of flus that are essentially endemic. And then there are some that come up seasonally and generate sort of our definition of an epidemic. So when we think about transmission, that's another aspect to understanding how disease spreads. It's critical to understand the transmission. And I would dare say that we're still working on that for COVID. So modes of transmission, direct from an infected person, cough, sneeze, body fluids, indirect an infected person to an intermediate object. These are the so-called fomites, or a medium like air or water, or an organism like a vector to a person. So the vectors, as we've been talking about them, most common are mosquitoes, fleas, ticks, some sort of biting or injecting animal, and they generally are invertebrates, insects. You control the insect, you control the vector, you control the disease. As we now know, of course, there are vectors and reservoirs that are somewhat unknown. Then we can think about these terms of horizontal transmission, person to person within the same generation. So we have colds, flu, STDs, things like that. Vertical might be a parent to a child, and HIV can be transmitted this way. German measles can be transmitted this way. Even chickenpox can be transmitted this way. And so that's why pregnant moms have to be fairly closely monitored, because there are a range of things they can get that can have a fairly significant effect on the fetus. So another thing you need to know is the routes of entry and release. And again, with COVID, there are some areas of transmission that are really well known, and then there are areas of transmission that probably aren't as effective and still generating some anxiety, i.e. surfaces and things. I think the more we find out, surfaces are not a great way to get the disease, and yet we still continue with, the journal, the Atlantic Monthly, refers to it as a theater of deep cleaning. So you have to know the routes of entry and release so you can begin to actually have some sort of block or therapy. As we've talked about this before, we have some fairly common sites: respiration, digestion, transdermal, accidents, bites, things like that, urogenital, STDs, UTIs, and then there is the sort of miscellaneous holes that you might have: tear ducts, sweat ducts, your ears. The portals of exit are essentially the same. Respiratory system is blind-ended. That is, you've got a sac, and so you pretty much go out the same way you came in. The digestive system is open-ended. You might have the infectious agent leaving through the mouth, and I'll leave that to you to consider how that could happen, or leaving through the anus, and again, diarrhea or throwing up. Yeah. Don't let people throw up on you. Don't let people poop on you. Bugs often enter through bites, and bacteria specifically, and often leave the same way. So various body fluids. The urogenital system is also a blind-ended. That is, it's rare for things to get in, travel through the urogenital system, and then end up someplace else and begin spreading that way. Some of the different parasites actually might do that, but for the most part, it's usually being released back through the same opening, the urethra, the vagina. So other kinds of blind systems are like the mammary glands, sweat ducts, eyes, things like that. All right. So we will pick up on some of the mechanisms by which different systems are able to respond to infection, specifically getting into the immune system when we next meet up. But yes, Friday being a celebration of scholarship, we will celebrate scholarship by not holding class. Thank you very much.